June 9th. We stopped about noon to stay until morning. We heard they would not let us pass through Kearney with less than 100 men. June 10th. They stayed here until 10 o'clock, talking about what they would do, and started. We passed below the town. They would not let us go through. I saw 2 long houses. I suppose it is their fort. Plenty of soldiers there. We passed through a village called Dogtown. We then came through another town called Doby. I sent a letter to the office by the captain for Betty. He brought me 3 letters. The girls are all at Mrs. Mays's wagon to hear her play the guitar. I'm Jen Globius, and this is the Hellenaki Deep Dive, a podcast about the process of geographic, historical, and archaeological research using open source tools. In this episode, I'll talk a little bit about music on the pioneer trails, and then dive into the mystery of Dogtown and Doby, 2 towns located near Fort Kearney. Let's dive in. So for this week, I've continued my tagging. The entries I read at the top of the show are from early June, but I'm actually through July 5th. But the mystery of Dogtown and Doby were too intriguing not to talk about this in this episode. But I also, to start with, want to talk a little bit about music. I was struck by the last line in the June 10th entry, where Ruth Shackelford says that the girls were at Mrs. Mays's wagon to hear her play guitar. Both before and after this entry, Ruth Shackelford records that the girls are singing, there's other singing going on, sometimes there's dances. And it really made me think about how music is something that travels with you. Mostly songs, since as long as you remember the lyrics and the tune, it's very, very portable. But also sometimes your instruments. I think this is the only entry I'm aware of that it says that Mrs. Mays has a guitar, which would be fairly portable. Other things like pianos and organs wouldn't have been, but harmonicas, all sorts of other instruments could have easily been transported as people were coming west. But thinking about songs from home and songs that come with you, it put me in mind of the podcast Dolly Parton's America, which I listened to recently. In episode 4, called Neon Moss, there's a discussion about the universality of songs yearning for home. That you can sometimes have the same type of song, or a song that evokes the mountains in different places, or your home that cuts across cultural differences, whether it's Tennessee or Lebanon. It's interesting how we as humans bring music with us. Now, as the diary goes on, there are fewer and fewer mentions of music, and I wonder if this is partly because there's more sickness. Ruth Shackelford herself gets sick in the mountains, and so at times she discusses other things much less. The terrain became rougher after this point. Right now, in this June 9th and 10th entries, they're in present-day Nebraska along the Platte River, so a fairly easy area to traverse. It's before they get to the Rocky Mountains, which is much easier. But I also wondered, thinking about music and as they travel, what songs would the Shackelfords and the others they were traveling with sing? Like, what was the music of people that they would have brought with them from Missouri to California? I did a little Google search, as you do, and I found a songbook called Songs and Dances of the Oregon Trail. I'll put a link to the website for the songbook on the show notes. Now, the songbook has 60 songs. Just a few that you might have heard of: Buffalo Gals, Home Sweet Home, Oh Susanna, Pop Goes the Weasel, She'll Be Comin' Round the Mountain, the children's song as we think of it, Skip to My Lou, Turkey in the Straw, and many others that I hadn't heard of. So many of these songs brought and still sung today. So if you know anything about like the pioneer music, I would be really, really interested to hear if you have any other tidbits about the music that the pioneers brought with them. All right, so with that, let's change gears and let's talk about the mystery of the towns of Dogtown and Doby near Fort Kearney. I was going along, minding my own business, tagging locations in the diary Node Goat when I got to July 10th, which I read at the beginning of the show. Now, between the 9th and the 10th, there are 3 locations mentioned. There's a fort, which is Fort Kearney. And we know this because in the July 9th entry, it mentions Kearney, although it spells it with a C instead of a K. It's spelled a little wrong, but it's Kearney. That's about where they were. So that's the first location, so Fort Kearney. The second place is Dogtown. Now, the Kindle edition of the edited book I have has this footnote, and I quote, "This town was called both Dogtown and Georgetown. It was later changed to Glenville." And this was by Lillian L. Fitzpatrick, Nebraska Place Names. It says Lincoln 1960, pages 42 through 43, end quote. When I Googled, looked up where Glenville was located, it turns out that Glenville is southeast of Hastings, of the town of Hastings, and it's over 40 miles away from the location of Fort Kearney. Now, this is a problem. Now, Hastings is further south than the Shackelfords were traveling. They had mostly been following the route. They'd been following the path of the Platte since they crossed into what becomes Nebraska. And I'm pretty sure they did not deviate and head south towards where Hastings is. And it's also problematic because they mention a short time after passing, they mention the fort that they can't go by, but they can see it. And then they mention Dogtown and then Doby. So those locations have to be close to Fort Kearney. So the place where I'm starting most of my place name, the town research, is with geonames.org. When I look up Dogtown, Nebraska, specifying both Dogtown and Nebraska, I get an entry for Glenville as the first one. But there's also an entry for Valley City Historical, which is very close to the location of Fort Kearney. So this is a really good sign. Now, it turns out that the reference that the editors used for Nebraska place names by Lillian Fitzpatrick, it was originally published in 1925, and that 1925 publication is available online from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And I'll put a link to Nebraska place names in the show notes as well. The text is organized by county, and both Dogtown, aka Valley City, and Doby would be in Kearney County, which is where Fort Kearney is. As a side note, this is not the same county that the town of Kearney is located, because that's in the county to the north, which is called Buffalo County. Coming back to our story, I looked through Nebraska place names in Kearney County, and there's no sign of Dogtown or Valley City or Doby. No mentions of them at all. So by 1925, those place names were not extant. They did not exist any longer. Now, I've run across another volume that's interesting. It's called The History of Nebraska from 1882, or originally published in 1882 by Andreas, who was also the cartographer for some of the county maps in Iowa that I used in a couple episodes ago to figure out town locations. Besides being a cartographer, Andreas was also a historian, and you can find The History of Nebraska and other books available online. I'll put a link to The History of Nebraska. So, History of Nebraska, also organized by county. And in the entry for Kearney County, there is a Valley City, the location that I found using GeoNames. And so it says Valley City is on the eastern part of the reservation on which Fort Kearney was located, not far from the present-day town of Lowell. That's very good information. Yay. Now we have a general idea. There's a couple other places. So there's no Doby mentioned, but there is a central city. Note, this is not the present-day Central City, Nebraska, which is further to the north. There's also mention of a Kearney City and Junctionville. And interestingly, in Andreas's History of Nebraska, it said that Kearney City was also called Adobe Town by freighters. Now, Adobe is really close in sound to Dobby or Doby. So I wonder if Ruth Shackelford had heard this nickname without the town and was like, oh, it's Adobe. So I had one more resource that I looked up to see if I was on the right track with this. So there's a booklet published around 1981 by the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. It's titled The Oregon Trail, Rock Creek Station, Nebraska to Fort Laramie, Wyoming. And I'll post a link to where you can download this booklet as well. It's great because it lists interesting places along the trail, but also like Pony Express and stage stations, which seem like natural stopping points or points that travelers would have noted as like, hey, there's a ranch here. That seems very likely to have good information about them. So there's two entries that are useful here. Nebraska Pony Express Station number 12, named Kearney Station. And in this entry, the authors wrote that it was also known as Dogtown or Valley City, located 1.5 miles northeast of Lowell in Kearney County. So that seems good information. So Valley City seems pretty stable. That would have been the Dogtown that Ruth Shackelford mentioned in her diary. The next entry for Pony Express, Nebraska, station number 13 for Fort Kearney. And in this entry, the authors note that the Pony Express station would not have actually been at the fort because that was on a reservation, but actually at Dobytown, which was 2 miles west of the fort on the edge of the reservation. And that Dobytown was also known as Kearney City, so that checks out. There is a problem with this Nebraska Game and Parks Commission booklet is that it is not a scholarly work. You can tell that whoever wrote this or the compilation of sources, combination of people who wrote this, like did a lot of research, looked at a lot of things, but there are hardly any references. There's 3 sources that are referenced in the back. One of them is Andreas's History of Nebraska that I previously talked about from 1882. But they're in a scholarly work, most of these locations and statements would have been footnoted or there would be references for where the source of the information came from. That is problematic, but this seems like about as good of an information as I'm going to get right now, so I'm going with it. So we have decent information. I looked up, so Valley City had already showed up when I searched GeoNames. So Valley City is good to go for Dogtown. And Kearney City was also available in GeoNames, looked pretty good. And so the location of Dobby was also known. Both of these were tagged as uncertain for the certainty because although there's a good number of references that kind of led me, as you just heard, that led me to identify them, that's still a lot of steps. So in general, it's fairly uncertain. It could be more than one place, but it's not very uncertain because there are some good references. And with that, that's it for this episode of the Halanaki Deep Dive. Just to give you a heads up, I'm taking a break for the holidays, so the next episode will be available in 3 weeks, so in 2021 on Thursday, January 7th. If you enjoyed the Halanaki Deep Dive, please subscribe or leave a review and tell a friend about it. To support the Halanaki Deep Dive financially, you can become a supporter on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. And at the $5 per month level or higher, you'll get access to exclusive behind-the-scenes content every month. The Halanaki Deep Dive is written and produced by me, Jen Globius of the Halanaki. The theme music is Deep Ocean Instrumental by Dan O of danosongs.com. Thanks for listening.